Hey everyone, so as a follow-up to the raid DPS guide, I decided to make one for dungeons as well. You guys were really heavily requesting this, so I'm happy to make this follow-up video. Now, a couple things that are different between dungeons and raids. First, I'm only going to make fire team based guides for dungeons. I'm planning on making a solo DPS strategy guide / ranking in the near-ish future, so keep your eyes peeled for that, I suppose. But for now, that topic is a little bit more complicated, and it would make this video too long. So just like with dungeons, how I didn't cover like low man damage strategies, I'm not going to cover solo damage strategies for dungeons, just fire team, like if you're farming an encounter or going for some full clears, your weekly completions, what would make your damage consistently easy compared to what you may have been using before. So number 2, also, because you're 3 people and not 6 people in dungeons, certain weapons gain value while other weapons lose value. So for example, Lumina becomes more valuable because you're giving a 35% buff to all of your team, and you can do this 3 separate times, whereas in a raid, you'd only be able to give all of your teammates that buff just once because you have 5 teammates instead of just having 2. On top of that, Divinity becomes less valuable. Any weapon where you're basically lowering your damage, even Tractor is included, any weapon where you're lowering your damage to buff the damage of your teammates by compromising, that's not really going to cut it when it comes to dungeons. And finally, last but not least, the default assumptions, if I don't mention anything for your specific class, Titan is probably going to be on Cuirass or Star Eater Eternal Thundercrash, Warlock is going to be on Star Eater Nova or Sanguine Well, and Hunter is going to be on Celestial Nighthawk, just like I mentioned in the previous video. So with that out of the way, let's go from start to finish when it comes to dungeons. We're going to be going chronologically and starting with the Shattered Throne. Now, much like Last Wish, the Shattered Throne is located in the Dreaming City, which means I have the same activity-wide comments for the Shattered Throne that I did for Last Wish, and that is that there is no longer any Taken spec in the game, and in my opinion, curses and blessings are a little unnecessary, on top of the fact that curses are no longer available on non-hunter classes anyway. So there's only 2 bosses in the Shattered Throne, much like most of the dungeons in this game, so let's go ahead and start with the first one, Vorgeth. Now, unlike most dungeons in this game, you don't get rally flags in the Shattered Throne, which means that you're going to be arriving at Vorgeth probably on an eager edge sword if you're trying to do the dungeon at a fast pace, which means I'm going to prefer using something like a special weapon in this encounter. So in my opinion, to make things really easy, this guy falls over super fast. He's barely like mini boss level when it comes to doing damage, so I'm just going to recommend honestly using Choir and a damage super. Choir is great because it pops the void shields of the wizard very quickly, it has great ammo efficiency, and a single mag from everyone plus a damage super, or literally just a damage super with like a weaken, is enough to kill this guy. So you're probably on a sword from the previous transition section, so that just makes this really simple compared to if you were to try to use an exotic heavy weapon or a heavy DPS weapon, and that way you can also stay on a sword going to Dul Incaru as well, which is a fair distance away. Dul Incaru is the final boss of the Shattered Throne, and funnily enough, she is actually classified as an elite when it comes to damage scaling, and as you guys are probably aware at this point, the Wardcliff Coil does crazy high damage scaling to elites in particular, as with a lot of exotic rocket launchers, and so my recommendation for Dul Incaru is to convert any sword ammo that you have. You can kind of farm in the thrallway if you need to, but convert any sword ammo that you have into like even a single Wardcliff shot, and it will absolutely nuke this boss. Just get like a buff, debuff off of like Radiant Melee or like, Weakened Grenade, anything like that, and just nuke the boss once you pick up those 3 charges from the Knights, and you should be pretty set. Pit of Heresy is going to be the only dungeon on our list today that actually only has 1 boss throughout its entire duration, and that's going to be, of course, Zulmak. Now, Zulmak has just the small amount of health required that everybody can just use 1 fully loaded Parasite with max stacks, and of course a damage super, a strong damage super from everyone in the fire team, and that should just outright kill the boss. If you add in a little special weapon damage just in case, something goes wrong, you should be able to kill this boss fairly consistently without too much headache. Prophecy is up next. No Taken spec here either, unfortunately, now that that's gone, so let's just jump right into the first boss, which is of course Phalanx Echo. Now, Phalanx Echo, in my opinion, is kind of like the last pushover boss when it comes to dungeons. After this, if you go ahead and look at the bosses tab in my damage spreadsheet, the boss health on dungeons just goes up and up and up and hasn't stopped going up since then. So Phalanx Echo, you can use Parasite plus a damage super if you want to be on a sword for the Wasteland section, so you can be on like Bastion for the Blights or something. People have used Horsemen before, Trench Barrel shotguns, plenty of stuff you can use. You can probably use Choir on this guy too if you have a well, so it just, counts as super damage and goes through his shield. But again, Lots of options you can use here. I don't think anybody's really struggling with this boss. Obviously, solo is a little bit of a different story, but again, that will be a subject for another video. Kell Echo is the final boss of the Prophecy dungeon, and unlike a lot of the bosses from this era, it has a fair amount of health and also an extremely long phase, only second to the more recently introduced Vesper's Host final boss, which is of course the Corrupted Puppeteer, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with at this point. So Kell Echo, I'm going to suggest two things here, either Choir of One or Still Hunt if you're on Celestial Hunter, Heavy Jail, and a damage super. And the reason for this is because unlike in speedruns where you're kind of going for a one plate and Choir doesn't really make sense because you're basically just where you drop down from the elevator, you're going to be moving and following the boss for maybe a 2, 3, or 4 plate kill. And so because of this, Choir actually ends up being pretty good. If you're one plate away from the boss, it's kind of like the optimal distance to be using Choir. And Heavy Jail, I don't really think I need to explain this, very easy. People have been using Heavy Jails on Kell Echo since before it was even super meta, and now that Heavy Jails are like kind of the defining meta when it comes to burst damage on dungeon bosses, I would say it's an irresistible choice to recommend for this boss. Grasp of Avarice is going to be really just more of the same, to be honest. These two bosses are quite similar in terms of damage profile and damage phase length and really just everything in terms of mechanics. You're just dunking most into a crystal and then going to town on them. Phry'zhia, I'm going to recommend the same thing that I recommended for Kell Echo, either Choir of One or Still Hunt plus a Heavy Jail and a damage super. You can use rockets on these bosses too, but I would honestly just go with the Heavy Jail route so no one needs to run galley and there's no kind of complications in terms of team setup in that way. And then I'm just going to skip right to Avarokk because, I'm going to recommend the same things. It's just Choir of One, Still Hunt, Heavy Jail, damage super. If you want to be fancy, you can use a Cascade Heavy Jail, but again, if your teammates are not pulling their weight as much, Cascade becomes a little bit more of a struggle once you dump your first mag. Of course, in speedrunning, the answer is just, you Still Hunt to proc Cascade and then dump one mag and the boss should be dead, but obviously in LFG situations, when not everybody is going to be running the optimal damage setup, that might not always be the best idea. Duality is the middle point as the 5th dungeon of the day. Let's go ahead and start with our first boss, which is of course Gahlran. Now, Gahlran, kind of interesting. You can use kind of two options here. In speedrunning, people use surrounded bequests so that they can conserve more ammo than using something like the other recommendation I'm going to make, which is of course Akelous. Having a well can be pretty helpful here because you do get jumped on quite a bit, but besides that, just run damage supers. If you're fast, you can use that unstable essence bonus that you get from those shades that you kill right before entering the damage phase. They give you a 50% damage boost to Gahlran, so kind of make use of that time and dump as much burst as you can while that timer is still on your screen. Besides that, if you just kind of run 3 Akelous and everybody is kind of just doing their job and you have a consistent debuff and a buff, this boss should fall over pretty consistently in a 1 phase. Caiatl is next up. She is one of my favorite dungeon damage phases to execute because there's like 3 separate bells and she kind of just sits still and lets you wail on her, which is always fun, of course. And I'm just kind of going to recommend the same things that I did for Avarokk, Phry'zhia, and Kell Echo, which is of course Choir of One / Still Hunt if you're on Hunter, Heavy Jail, and damage super. I think most people are pretty familiar with how to do damage on Caiatl. You can also use other close damage options, like for example Akelous is fine on this boss, but in my opinion Heavy Jail is pretty nice, especially given that there's 3 bells, so you can kind of reload your Heavy Jail between bells if you want to use something like Cascade Point to make the best use of your Waking Resonance timer. Spire of the Watcher is our next dungeon, and there are no special modifiers here, so let's just jump straight into our first boss, which is of course going to be Akelous or Gauss Harpy Part 2. Now, Akelous and Consecrated do have some differences that I'd like to make note of. First, Akelous's eyes have way less health than Consecrated, which means that a lot of players find it more productive to use something like a 1-for-all trace over a 140 sniper. And that's because you can pre-proc 1-for-all on the ads that are nearby and absolutely shred through those eyes, and that's because the eyes are actually part of the damage phase timer on Akelous, unlike Consecrated, which means that if you take too long to break all the eyes, then that actually cuts into your damage phase timer significantly. On top of this, anecdotally at least, the Spire Harpy seems to provide a lot less trouble when it comes to using tracking projectiles compared to the Gauss Harpy, which means that using something like Cataclysm Nova or Needle Storm may be a lot more favorable than using it on Harpy, although your mileage may vary. So what am I going to recommend here? Well, consistent damage wise, I think Whisper is by far the king on this boss. It's very easy to use. You don't really need to sprint after the boss. You can just walk forward slowly so you can still see his crit as he dips down. So it's a fairly easy option. Speedrunners do use Apex Predator or some sort of rocket with maybe Radiant Dance Machines on this boss as you follow him down the lane and keep dodging and shooting rockets over and over without galley, of course, but that's because they're in a very damage restricted environment. But 3 Whispers with some sort of decent consistent and debuff, like from concussive reload, should net you a 1-phase consistently with 3 people, provided that you don't have someone on skip like they do in speedrunning. Persys is a bit unique amongst the other dungeon bosses because its crit is a little inaccessible or annoying to hit with something like a linear or whisper, and so as a result, we're just going to recommend the classic that we've been recommending on stuff like Kell Echo, Choir 1, Phry'zhia, Damage Super. Obviously, you're not going to be using something like Celestial Nighthawk, so you should opt for Star Eater Blade Barrage or Star Eater Mobius Quiver on Hunter, and Still Hunt is obviously not going to be a great option on this boss either, but Choir 1, Phry'zhia, Damage Super should be fairly consistent to use on this boss, and obviously make sure if you're using Choir 1, don't barrel stuff the guy, just do it from like 8 or 9 meters away, which is the optimal distance to be doing choir damage anyways. Ghost of the Deep is our next dungeon, and this is where dungeons really take a turn for the tanky, and I mean tanky. Some of these dungeon bosses have more health than the average raid boss, which is pretty crazy. Now, what makes these two bosses, Ecthar and Simmumah, special? Well, not only are they loose and hive, which means they have ghosts you need to crunch when you're done killing them, but they also have these shields in front of their main health bar that you need to break before you do damage, and they're around like just under 1 million health if I remember correctly. I didn't test them exactly, but that's approximately correct. So some of the exotics that we use for these damage phases, specifically Wink Wink Arbalest, are going to be tailor-made for the damage strategies that are for these two bosses. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start with Ecthar. When it comes to Ecthar, I'm actually going to recommend 2 separate damage loadouts for 2 different roles. 2 people are going to be on Akelous, and they're going to be responsible for doing the bulk of the damage to the boss. Fairly easy Akelous boss, doesn't really move around too much, easy melee range, not super particularly dangerous. And the third person is actually going to be on Arbalest and Surrounded Caraxes. Now Arbalest with a damage buff still 1-bangs the shield, but in terms of the Caraxes, Surrounded is normally kind of annoying on this boss if you use something like a rocket because you blow up all the ads that would be giving you Surrounded normally, but because the 2 of your teammates are in fact on Akelous, you can afford to use something like Surrounded Caraxes and still get away with doing decent damage without having to swap your heavy weapon because you were using Arbalest to Akelous and then lose a bunch of total damage in the process. Now Simmumah is going to involve a kind of similar strategy, obviously minus the Akelous as she's in the air. If you guys didn't know this about Simmumah, if you break her shield really quickly with something like Arbalest and then use Tether, she tends to not teleport as much. In fact, she kind of just stays still for the most part and moves around a tiny bit, so that can really help you in using something like a heavy GL, which is what I'm going to recommend here. You could use something like Microcosm, but this boss does have a lot of health, and so I'm willing to recommend a higher damage option like Caraxes with Surrounded, even if it's a little bit less consistent or a little bit more risky, just so you're more likely to get the 1 phase. And I don't think it's too hard to get her to stop moving with this strategy, and it doesn't involve any crazy specialized knowledge or anything like that. So a well is great for survivability, Tether again to make sure she doesn't move, the other person can be on a damage super, and then you can do like Arbalest or Still Hunt plus the Caraxes like I mentioned, and you're going to make sure that you break her shield quickly. Warlord's Ruin is a little special amongst the dungeons in the same way that Pit is. Pit has only 1 boss for the entire dungeon. Warlords has 3 encounters and 3 bosses, which is still the highest number of bosses we've seen in any dungeon to this date. So let's go ahead and start with Rathil. So Rathil, I'm going to go ahead and recommend Lumina or Ergo Sum. Obviously just have 1 Ergo Sum providing Wolfpack rounds to the rest of the team. The other 2 people can be on Lumina or even like 4th Horseman or something like that. And then I'm going to suggest Surrounded Bequest. This boss is super easy to maintain Surrounded on because of the constantly spawning ads near the totems. And of course he is a very easy sword boss as well. Decent hitbox, doesn't move too much, melee range, great boss for doing that sort of thing. And then obviously you can run a damage super as well on top of your standard debuff and buff sources. The Locus of Wailing Grief is the second Warlord's boss, the Ogre. I'm going to recommend similar stuff for him and Hefnd. Now, you can use Merciless or Choir of 1 on that first little lantern slash flame that you get, and that's because you don't get surrounded there, so you can just pad your damage in the meantime. Merciless, obviously, if you have 3 of them, you have to kill 3 ads as a fire team to proc Impetus, so that can be kind of annoying and cut into your surrounded. Choir, maybe a little bit easier to use, doesn't chew through your ammo as quickly, and then once you move to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th flames, you should have ads for Surrounded, so Surrounded Caraxes is fairly easy to use on this boss, not super big risk of blowing yourself up either, and then you can just use your standard damage supers on top of your standard buff and debuff as well. Hefnd is similar to Locus in that there are adds nearby to proc Surrounded, but his damage phase is a lot shorter, so you may want to consider using more bursty weapons, especially if you're on Hunter. Still Hunt is great on this boss to just pop with your Nighthawk. On top of that, you may want to consider even using Cascade Point on something like a VS Chill Inhibitor on top of your Surrounded proc, because it's just that much shorter of a damage phase compared to something like Locus, and you can always reload your heavy GL for the next floor so that you can have that Cascade proc once more on top of your standard damage super, buff, and debuff. As the newest dungeon on the block, Vesper's Host has given us two of the most unique boss model / damage phases in the entire game, and their uniqueness is not like shared and common, I would say. So let's just go ahead and start with Raneiks, which is of course the baby clone multi-servitor split thing. And I'm going to recommend two weapons here that are a bit non-standard. The first being Wardcliff Coil. If you've seen a Vesper's Host speedrun until now, it absolutely shreds, especially if you're on a Warlock with Song of Flame. And then Dimensional Hypotrichoid is also an option with One for All. That's the heavy waveframe from Lightfall. If you guys are not familiar, it rolls with One for All, and every single servitor counts as a separate enemy, which means you have consistent One for All procs for the entire damage phase. Now, a word of caution, remember that heavy waveframes in my testing have significantly reduced damage output if you use them in fire teams of more than one, and so I would not recommend having multiple heavy waveframes, maybe just one and then two Wardcliffs, or like maybe two heavy waveframes and one Wardcliff, because they don't stack perfectly. You're going to lose a lot of damage if you have three people just spamming them together. And the damage super situation on this boss is a little unique as well. Unlike on other bosses, T-Crash is fine, but Star Eater Glacial Quake is significantly better. Tether, when it's re-enabled, I don't know if you guys have seen the clips of what this thing does on Master, because Bungie forgot to disable Tether for Master Vesper. It crashes the instance, but when it's re-enabled and fixed properly, I'm sure Tether will be the best option on Hunter. Until then, Star Eater Silence and Squall is excellent because it consistently hits almost the entire crowd of baby servitors. And then finally, if you're on Warlock, Song of Flame with Rain of Fire and Wardcliff Coil is excellent, and I'm going to show a clip on screen right now, if I remember to, of the speedrun for Vesper's Host, which you can see uses Warlocks on Song of Flame and Rain of Fire in order to abuse the double dash that you get without heat rises. The final boss that I have to talk about today in dungeons is of course the Corrupted Puppeteer, which has posed one of the most unique damage challenges and phases in Destiny 2 dungeon history. And that's because this boss has a total of 16.3 million health, which fits snugly between Explicator and Rolk, which, mind you, those are raid bosses where you have 6 people doing damage. In dungeons you only have 3, which is crazy. Those bosses aren't even slouches either, they're on like the higher end of raid boss health. And so this is obviously compensated by the fact that the Puppeteer has an unprecedented, almost 100-second long damage phase, which is by far the longest of any non-infinite damage phase in the game, which is pretty crazy in and of itself. And so in the past, in other videos, I've said that, people are mistaken when it comes to Destiny. Total damage scenarios generally don't exist outside of like day ones and masters. Generally, bosses in Destiny have low enough health that burst damage weapons are always going to be the priority in standard content. The Corrupted Puppeteer puts an end to that once and for all. This boss has so much health that the damage strategies that have been devised for it, that have been seen as the most effective for it, are just completely different than what you would use on most of the other dungeon bosses with a fair amount of health, which is, as you've probably seen by now, Choir of One, Heavy GL, Still Hunt, etc. On Puppeteer, the damage phase strategies that people found to be the most consistent for like a one phase are Grand Overture, which is kind of surprising, but Grand Overture has a fairly high DPS value on top of very good total damage if you pre-stack it, and Anarchy with something like Supremacy or Lost Signal. Now, I haven't done a lot of testing on my own on this dungeon because I'm not speedrunning it or anything, so I'm going off of what other speedrunners have decided to use in terms of consistency, and what they've decided to use are kind of those two weapons on top of using something like Sanguine Well, swapping to Arc, and using Facet of Courage by abusing something like Slice or Solitude, or maybe like a Silence and Squall, so you can keep that Facet of Courage uptime without having to swap weapons or stop shooting Grand Overture. Again, this marks a significant departure from how damage phases were initially and originally planned out in speedrunning. Typically, it's pretty rare to see damage strategies in speedrunning that are focused around a single exotic heavy weapon outside of Wardcliff, and so this is an unprecedented change in total damage scaling in Destiny 2 dungeons, and I'm pretty excited to see if Bungie will choose to make another boss that has just like this much health, that people are kind of forced to use day 1 level exotic heavy weapons in order to keep up the pace in total damage, even foregoing something like a heavy GL even after they've been buffed and we've, had new options released to the public. that's pretty much all I have to say about dungeons. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to what I think are the more consistent ways to one-phase bosses in fire teams. Obviously, I had to make some compromises here. I didn't try to go super optimal and just like recommend cascade point heavy jails for certain bosses, or like rockets where they're used in speedrunning on certain bosses still. And obviously, I didn't want to make it so that you're compromising your damage too much. On certain bosses, I recommended slightly more risky strats because the one-phase kind of tipping point is a little more oriented towards the optimal side. So yeah, I hope I struck the right balance here, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. The next video that is going to come out is probably going to be around the ignition patch for Act 2, and hopefully we're going to have some time to do some damage testing and really kind of flesh out the videos that I've been teasing on stream recently. And yeah, I'm going to be pretty busy next week with school stuff, but hopefully I'll have enough time to make those videos, and yeah, I'll see you then.